tell me a bit more about Nibiru? And I really want to understand the reason do you build it?
The project kind of unfurled naturally from the initial desire to build a combination of apps that worked really well together and wanting to make optimizations at the base layer that almost like required making a chain. So at this point, it'd be like thinking of that in 2021 coming into 22, but we were wanting to develop this like novel way to do perpetual stacks trading application, and found like, okay, if we do this, we can like improve the way liquidations are handled. If we change this in the base layer, we can get the block times a lot faster. And then that's almost like the motivation behind building a chain at first for us was to develop multiple applications on top of it, actually, rather than like making a chain in and of itself as the goal.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have the absolute pleasure to interview Unique, the co-founder and CEO of Nibiru, and we'll be talking about L1s and compatibility. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we go into the technical part of this conversation, can you tell me a bit more about yourself and your background? What brings you to crypto?
Sure. So I guess the foray into it was just a warm referral from a close buddy, but my background was studied applied physics at Columbia University and also AI, and then I worked as an AI software engineer for several years before getting into Web3. So how I got into the space was working on developing automated strategies for vaults for other people to deposit into. And so basically just really heavy into DeFi and learning about Uniswap and Aave and essentially trading on chain, and more like data science work. And that got me working on the Simultaneous protocol in 2021. And yeah, from there, started Nibiru like a couple months post that. And so that was how I got into the space.
And is there a connection between applied physics and blockchain developments? And what do you think are some of the essential skills that you obtain in the early stage of your career that you've applied later on? And I guess there is a direct connection between AI and blockchain, but I'm really interested in understanding like this, the mindset that you obtain while you're trained as a physicist.
So I think that definitely hints at it. So it's not so much the discipline directly, like the math skills and stuff you're picking up that are initially applicable. Although obviously math is still relevant to a lot of the economic side and work in technical work in distributed systems. But definitely the rigor that they bring to the field when you're learning physics at a high level, especially if you're on track to pursue a PhD. You get really good at understanding complex systems, breaking things down into like the core fundamentals of how they really work, and really just not working off of just modeling something and working purely from a model, but actually really go and test your assumptions and really that kind of I would say maybe the common element between that AI and what you need to do to excel and work on like blockchain is knowing how to say, okay, here's some hypothesis or model I have about, Web3 or the world or a product, then turn it into an experiment that I can test and then iterate on, right? So that's definitely applicable, not just in like Web3, but in like a bunch of disciplines. Yeah.
And can you tell me a bit more about the name of the project? Because in preparation for the interview, I was wondering what the project is named after. And there are speculations that it was a small planet between Jupiter and Mars. But also, some people are talking about the Nibiru um, kind of traumatic, disastrous events that could occur, and it's essentially like you probably will be better at explaining it than me, but a larger planetary object smashing into the planet and having devastating effect. But yeah, tell me a bit more about the name, and I guess as a physicist, tell me a bit more about the history of the name.
Yeah, so it's not that it's somewhat common of a name in like uh, science fiction pop culture a little bit, or a little bit of like people making. Sometimes they'll like to have Nibiru positioned as like a planet or um, a different like society. Like basically, it comes from Babylonian astronomy. So it associates closely. The name associates closely with transition or disruption of an existing system. So like it translates to crossing or point of transition, and it's used as you were talking about in a lot of other things. So there's people that have, they'll like to back go back and forth on like different conspiracy theories and like make a name of like a planet X. It's other things too, though. It's like a planet inside of the Star Trek storyline. It's a Yu-Gi-Oh card. There's all you'll see people throw around all sorts of ideas online, um, and then a lot of that is derived from like the works. At least when I looked it up, of this ancient astronaut writer, and their basically interpretations of the Babylonian and Sumerian mythology. But that's kind of where the name comes from. So basically, that like uh, turning point or transition is like the loose concept, and people apply it in a lot of basically with a bunch of space themes. Yeah.
And what does it symbolize for you? Why did you choose this particular name?
I guess because with transition, you can relate that to like disruption. So basically, that you're like changing it up, or disrupting the existing system. So it seemed to like mesh well with the Web3 ethos.
And before we actually talk about Nibiru, can you tell me something interesting about yourself and what do you enjoy doing in your free time? And how do you occupy your days? Because I've listened to some interviews with you and you tend to focus on the technical details of the project, and that's something that I'm really interested in discussing with you. But I also want to learn a bit more about you as a founder and what do you do in your free time to begin with? But also, yeah, tell me a bit more about yourself, your hobbies.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, I guess if it's in spare time, so if we're eliminating all of the stuff that's like on work and programming, um, sometimes it'll still be like tinkering and building stuff like in software anyway, even if it's for spare time. Um, but largely, yeah, I guess I I feel like it's mostly just going to the gym and then I'll like practice instruments, right? So I played the saxophone a decent amount and started picking up the piano last year, but uh, yeah. Oh, and I guess study of foreign language. So I happen to speak a pretty high degree of like Japanese, and then started learning like Spanish as well. Spanish is way more beginner, but Japanese I took to like reading, writing proficiency, and speaking. So um, I don't know, just still like learning other stuff. So basically, it's instruments and then I guess language practice. If I had to,
Would you ever relocate to Japan?
probably not permanently, without a good reason. But I visited for uh, with two friends for a long stay, and that was like very enjoyable. Like it's definitely a place I could like spend a lot of time and be happy.
Nice. Let's go to the technical part of this conversation. So tell me a bit more about Nibiru, and I really want to understand the reason do you build it, because there are a lot of L1s and there are arguments that will see consolidation. So do you believe in that thesis, or do you believe in the thesis that we'll see a lot of app chains that will be specializing in particular use cases?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it definitely be a blend. But at least for the start of your question is the project kind of unfurled naturally from the initial desire to build a combination of apps that worked really well together, and uh, wanting to make optimizations at the base layer that almost like required making a change. So at this point, it'd be like thinking of that in 2021 coming into 22, but we were wanting to develop this like novel way to do perpetual perpetuals DEX trading application and found like, okay, if we do this, we can like improve the way liquidations are handled. If we change this in the base layer, we can get the block times a lot faster. And then that's almost like the the uh, the motivation behind building a chain at first for us was to develop multiple applications on top of it, actually, rather than like making a chain in and of itself as the goal. Which is interesting. Like we've seen, like we are definitely like later in that life cycle of that's like the idea of a project starting out. But it's cool that you kind of see it play out in real time, where that works with like Hyperliquid and other, and like Frax going to different chains of not necessarily like they're I wouldn't know that I would call them like an app chain necessarily, but that idea works out well. Like if you need to separate your infrastructure off and it's going to benefit you for some end user application, um, I do see that as like having worked several times. But to your point, you definitely still need generalized compute layers. Like, so it's definitely going to be a mixture, right? So, um, my example for like what might make sense as an app chain is, let's say like regulatory is swinging to be a lot more positive nowadays, right? Where players that were very hesitant to allow people to like get access to crypto are wanting to have like a large stake in it. Like especially lately, it's been like banks, right? So I could see, let's say I'm running a standard like U.S. Bank, right? I might want an app chain that's for specifically my like way of doing payments or something, right? Or like Base and Coinbase makes a lot of sense if you're wanting to move a lot of stuff to be more on chain. But then a lot of applications, obviously, right? You want to leverage the network effects that are already implicit of like an existing area, right? Like if you're doing most stuff with NFTs, you probably want to stick to like ETH and Solana, right? Rather than developing a new thing and having people migrate over to that. Uh, so it really just depends on like what that product is you're making, and like what if the pros of separating your infra off are strong enough to outweigh the network effects of using something that's already there.
And you build a blockchain using the SDK, the Cosmoverse SDK. Sorry, the Cosmos SDK, not the Cosmoverse. It's the event. But can you tell me a bit more about this ecosystem and how you feel about it? Because I believe that a lot of projects are utilizing the SDK, like Parachain, DYDX used it back in the day, even though they recently launched their own L1. But then, as soon as they launch the L1, they try to distance themselves from the ecosystem. Um, and it's very challenging for Cosmo to see any fees occurring on their L1, and they have some of the best stack out there, but it's very difficult to then monetize it. And I know that you might not have a strong opinion on it, and it's not necessarily directly related to the project, but I really want to hear your take on it and how do you guys think about it?
Yeah, I happen to uh, be a decent person to ask about this, so I can shed some light on that. So the I think part of it is, well, one is the Cosmos SDK is a layer zero stack. So if and speaking in terms of like layer zero, layer one, layer two, right, is what you have your things like Ethereum mainnet, Solana, right? Those are L1s. So the Cosmos SDK is a tech stack to make L1s, and then with IBC on top of that, they can mesh and play very nicely together. But they're not necessarily tied to each other in any other way, or if they don't choose to have any connections to other chains, it's not really like meshed like an ecosystem. So I think what people started realizing is um, people are most of the user base in Web3 that's like not just on centralized exchanges, but actually like uses the chains directly with self custody wallets, is familiar with like how the Ethereum ecosystem works. And in there, the you have the L1, and then a lot of the offshoots are all L2s. So I think what started happening was people thought that uh, Cosmos ecosystem, especially with like the name of the first chain being the Cosmos Hub, that it was like a hub and spoke model. but it's not a hub and spoke model. They're actually all kind of like they're just separate chains, and then they can choose to connect to each other if there's like a good rationale for it, right? So like a lot of chains connect to osmosis because there's a dex, like a very nice like user friendly dex there, right? Um, or like Noble adds access to like stablecoin liquidity, but otherwise, besides that point, it's really not like you don't gain any benefit from like associating yourself with a bunch of the other Cosmos stuff. Or if anything, there's almost like a negative connotation. So people that wanted to have new projects where they're, you know, changing a lot of things about the stack and they have their own innovations at play, and it basically doesn't have any utility that's tied to Cosmos. They don't advertise as Cosmos because it basically only is to their detriment. So I think that's why a lot of it comes from. I think like Barachain in particular like spoke about this on like Twitter a while ago when it was like, um, I'm not exactly like reading tweets a whole bunch, but I remember them in particular. Like I think Smokey like broke down the rationale as well, which is like very like close to how like I and we think about it on the team too. Yeah.
So, can you tell me a bit more about the differentiating factors of Nibiru and what makes you a unique L1 that projects would be compelled to build on?
Yeah, so it's a few things. So one is, uh, if I kind of broke it down point wise, would be um, the main thing we're trying to build is like a very coherent and performant base layer um, that gives you a good balance between like developer speed, the actual execution efficiency of transactions on the chain, and then also like what's targeted in the ecosystem from the business development side. So one aspect of that is being multi-VM. So we uh, the stack, speaking of the SDK, lets you build in modules. So it lets you kind of cleanly compose very different execution environments. So all that means is essentially developers can ship fast. So if they're used to working on standard EVM, um, they basically can change, close to nothing and launch if they're used to launching on like ETH1 or different L2s or something. They can deploy on Nibiru and set everything up very quickly. And then like the base layer gas token works as Ether on the network. So then that's useful for that. But then also we still have like Rust and Wasm. So a lot of the projects that had built on whether they were on like the Terra ecosystem or any of the like the other hundreds of chains that use like Wasm, um, that's also perfectly compatible on the chain. And you can have the contracts on different VMs and counts from different VMs call and interact with each other cleanly. So they're just, we made everything interoperable. Um, so that's really good for um, maybe not as apparent to like end users, but for people that are building applications is very useful. Um, the other side is then actual improvements to the base layer. So one is we work on we have like
Sorry, actually, before we move to the other side, can we just double down on the interoperability component? So, would that be available only to chains building within your ecosystem? And can you elaborate a bit more on it? Because I I think that you guys are now focusing on the Cosmosm and the EVM compatible blockchains. Are you planning to expand that?
yeah. So it's not a necessarily a tool for like other chains to have on top. I guess in one route you could say is if they use a multi-chain messaging uh, protocol, either through one of the existing ones like Euclid is one that's on top of us, but whether that's Layer Zero or Axelar, that could mesh well. But it's more so talking about on single chain interoperability. So of course, if a chain is using IBC, they can leverage a lot of what's on Nibiru to service their own ecosystem. Um, but for a lot of the interoperability we have is when you're already on the chain, i.e., if you have an app there, then let's say you move over, for example, Noble, the blockchain made a short-term US Treasury based stablecoin. So that gives you a return from T-bills, right? Um, that's already available. That's on IBC. So if someone wants to move that over to Nibiru, um, they can because we have the IBC connection. But then it can also be represented cleanly as like a canonical ERC20. So then it could leverage all of the EVM apps it can basically have access to, and then you could bridge it with layer zero too. Um, so really, it's only like one extra step. Basically, it's move it there, and you have one step, and you can, kind of bring the asset to like base or wherever, like use it on Solana, things like that. So that is actually that's adding a layer of interoperability without requiring people to like put their whole chain or like place the whole bet on top of us. Um, yeah. So a lot of it is like uh, that. So with one that I guess we could call like token or asset interoperability. The other would be like the contracts themselves. So a good example is like we have a liquid staking application on Nibiru that makes like a liquid stake Nibi and similar to essentially like the Lido on our chain. And it was initially a protocol built on Terra that's still around, and they do everything in ROSM, right? So everything's in Rust. Uh, but on our chain, there's also EVM wrappers that basically all of the functionality, like protocols can use it as if it's fully like Ethereum based, even though it's a Rust project. And yeah, and then if you're using it from the EVM, you end up with the ERC20s. If you're not, you end up with the normal way of doing things. And then cool thing there is it's meant to layer on top of like a Cosmos SDK proof of stake. So it is I don't know, it's like the perfect mesh for like our tech stack. So we'll start to see like more and more protocols like that. I think where not just the chain is multi-VM, but even the apps are like multi-VM too.
And can you just elaborate on what are the benefits of having multi EVM apps? Because having a multi EVM change is kind of self explanatory, but I honestly don't understand the benefit for the dApps.
Yeah, so why the apps would want that is it opens them up to a larger user base and liquidity, right? So, like, let's say you were, even to your question earlier, like someone that was building something and they say that they're, quote unquote, on Cosmos, but then the only user base they have access to is people that are already in the Cosmos ecosystem, which is fairly small compared to the rest of Web3, right? But if now you can say, okay, you want to maybe you got started on like a launch pad here, but then you make some sort of like interest bearing token or like cool yield protocol. And now you can bring it over to be a part of like Ethereum DeFi or like, you know, get it over to like Sonic or something. That's very useful, I would say, for like the teams developing the apps. And then also it works the other way. So stuff that's only available in like the Ethereum ecosystem can be brought over into the Cosmos very easily too via Nibiru. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. So this is mainly for DeFi, or is there an application that is building within the RWA or Deepin or even gaming that will benefit from this?
Yeah. So I guess you could, RWA is close enough that I almost consider like it's a, it's adjacent, but it's a part of it too. Cause a lot of the RWA stuff becomes like a DeFi element. So definitely it would be like, structured products, RWAs and DeFi. Um, Technically all of this is usable for games and stuff, but that I haven't seen anyone developing that specific use case yet. Um, but it is a fairly like general purpose tool.
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether you touched upon the second component of it because you were saying that the first one is about interoperability on apps and how that will benefit. And there was a second part to your statement, but I interrupted you. I'm not sure whether you remember it.
Oh, just on the description of the layer one. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So we were just talking about focusing on interoperability for a bit. The other side I was just mentioning was the actual base layer improvements. So when you're processing a block, basically there's consensus and execution, if you wanted to broadly think of it. So execution is given a set of several transactions in an initial state, produce the second, the resulting state. Consensus is agree to what is the official block and what are the transactions. So one thing there we have is a parallel optimistic execution. Basically, you overlap consensus and execution rather than having them uh, only done sequentially. So you can get a lot of additional performance through that, especially because usually the block that's proposed tends to be the one um, that's going to get executed anyway. So if you process it preemptively, you can get, you know, in the best case, maybe it's 2x performance, but it wouldn't be that good. Um, and then we also did some changes on just the base layer itself to make it, move from like uh, the default like 6 second block time that you see in a lot of the Cosmos SDK chains to like sub 2. Usually it's like 1.8 seconds with like a pretty large validator set. And then have basically a pipeline of a bunch of technical improvements to, add other ways of parallelizing execution, what we call like adaptive execution. And then also to improve on the consensus side as well. So yeah, that would be like a like just quick and dirty summary of like a bunch of the other things. But yeah.
I can't imagine what's the downside of having a simultaneous execution and consensus. I'm aware that most of the blockchains will do them uh, like one after the other. But could you just run me? I feel like I'm lacking some technical knowledge here, but can you tell me the downside of it? Because I want to understand what's the trade off. Every decision that you make as a developer, I assume, has a trade off, and I would appreciate if you can outline what's the trade off in that particular decision.
Yeah, so it's basically this. So at least in the Comma BFT case or Tenement case, the validators are already gossiping or passing around a block before you've officially confirmed in the consensus algorithm that that's going to be the exact one that that's given the block hash that you should work on as a node. But because the block is already being passed around before that, um, as a potential candidate for the next one, what people found is if you look at the stats, most of the time the block that's passed around before confirmation ends up being the one that's getting confirmed anyway. So what you can do then is start computing the state for the unconfirmed block, like what the resultant state would be. And then if consensus comes back and gives you the same hash, well, it's great. You already computed the state, so you don't have to redo that. It's done already. If it's different, then like the worst case, you just do it the normal way, like the slower way. So there's not there. This one is one of the kind of nice perks, I guess, where there doesn't seem to really be that big of a trade off. Besides that, it's newer and it hasn't become like a main, the main standard. It'll probably be like the very uh, normal way of doing things. Let's say in like a couple years, but some of the newer chains are uh, like let's say like Sui and Monad and stuff are like more so implementing these kind of features. But I think at some point maybe it'll be kind of like OP Stack, where like a lot of people do these type of technical improvements by default based on their tech stack. Yeah.
And if for whatever reason the block that has been gossiped around by the validators is not the correct block, how much longer would it take for validators to then consent on the block and just make sure that the next block is correct? Essentially what I'm trying to ask you is, would could this potentially be a blocker for larger institutions to adopt any blockchain, broadly speaking, because this could have a delay of extra, let's say, 5 seconds, but we don't know when, and it could happen once every, I don't know, 100 blocks or once every 1,000 blocks.
Yeah, gotcha. So it's not really, that's not a realistic uh, risk because you're not adding extra time. It's more so like the worst case of doing parallel optimistic execution is the way people do it now, like without that. So then it's like it's basically like a strict improvement, I would say. Um, but if I look at like a different side of your question, if you meant if people get used to the settlement speed of parallel and then one of them isn't parallel, could that cause issues? And then I guess it kind of comes back to the same thing. It would only be as slow as they're used to seeing right now, which means like let's just say hypothetically it was like a 2x improvement, then it would be like instead of 2 seconds it'd be 4 seconds, right? So that's not like the end of the world, yeah. But yeah, that'd be my most accurate answer, I guess I could give.
Yeah, and you touched upon the set of validators in your chain. Can you just tell me a bit more about the number of validators, how decentralized it is, and the cost for a 51% attack? Because this is another thing that a lot of new blockchains have to tackle. But also, it's just come up with this other question that I would like us to discuss about restaking, because this is something that actually I'll let you answer the first question, but please remind me to ask about restaking and how that compares with L1s, especially new L1s, if I forget about it.
Yeah, so Nibiru uses a it's on Comic BFT consensus, so it uses you have to get 2/3 majority rather than 51%, and then the validator set is I believe it's like 100. It might be over 100, but I believe we have it set to um, like the that setting, so it's close to more similar to like osmosis and stuff, where they have bigger validator sets rather than doing. I know some chains I'm seeing as small as like 30 or 20 or like 10 validators sometimes. But I think that's with not to pick on them, but I think part of it is just like people are saying as long as it's decentralized enough, they don't too much care that it's like maximally decentralized. Which I mean that's its own like thing to discuss, but yeah, so yeah, that's a rough proof of stake. So 2/3, and then the against like double signing and unbonding takes like 21 days. So you your theoretical amount of money you would need to attack the chain is actually a lot higher because it become like more and more expensive to get the tokens because of how much is staked. Yeah.
What's your take on something being decentralized enough for it not to be able to be attacked?
Hmm. Um, I guess it's for coming up for like not getting attacked is like that you can almost just compute in terms of the math. You could see like, is there like what's the staking percentage on the network? Is it high enough such that if someone needed to try to do an attack, they'd have to buy an outrageous amount of the tokens? And then the other side of it is like, uh, even if there is an attack, because the people that are not bad actors and not a hacker can basically say, okay, well, like just hypothetically, pretend there is an issue and then someone does an attack, but because it would be like so blatantly obvious and such a big deal, I think they would just roll back the block and like not let you do the attack anyway. Like the actual about it in practice, right? Like so the
Just to defend the other side of that argument, I don't think that the problem necessarily will be the attack itself or just having full control over the blockchain and doing some malicious activity like ruining the entire blockchain. I believe that they might exclude certain transactions or not, like, yeah, just mess up with the validator set or prevent certain people to include their transactions, which could be a bigger problem because no one would be aware of it, and now they'll have a full control over the blockchain.
yeah, for sure, for sure. No, I mean it's definitely like it's core to security, so it's important. But I mean, in some sense, like sometimes you see like Web3 uh, full like builders or founders or whatever getting too caught up in like centralization as the enemy, that they're like missing the product side of things. So um, like I mean, let's say in a, I mean, we were talking about like AI earlier, right? Like AI is thriving on centralized data and compute, and nobody seems to care. Like what? Well, and the reason is because it's very useful. Like when you use it, at least in Web3's decentralization pitch feels a lot like uh, a solution in search of a problem. Like you hear a lot about a lot in like the startup culture, um, and so yeah, especially when like performance is lagging or UX breaks. But I don't think the let's see. I guess it's like you have to build resilience behind the curtain, but users aren't going to like care too much about it as an ideology, I think. So yeah.
So, do you believe that we should be focusing on the decentralized enough rather than fully decentralized?
Hmm. I mean, yeah, I think there's something there. Probably decentralized. If I'm being like fully practical, it's like an honest take. Like probably decentralized enough is more reasonable or more practical. Like I definitely think Web3 has more of an issue of like finding a niche toward like solving real problems and making products that other people want that are in that have like don't have a better Web2 equivalent, and as a bigger issue than like decentralizing validator sets. I could yeah I could get behind that, I think.
No, I completely agree with you. Um, how do you feel? Oh yeah, another question that I want to ask is about restaking. So I struggle to understand why people should build on a new L1 when they could essentially tap into the security of Ethereum through a restaking protocol and get an extremely high security, a comparatively decentralized set of validators, or they can even, at some protocols, they can even choose how centralized their validators are and focus on building an application that is already within a comparatively thriving ecosystem rather than trying to build on a completely new ecosystem with a not limited, but a smaller number of users.
Yeah, it's really because you're saying if it's less secure, and then you get to kind of piggyback off of the deeper liquidity and stuff that's already there, and launch pads and all these other apps, why make something new? I think that really just comes down to, well, there's two reasons. I mean, there's probably a whole lot more, but I could say one is just if they want to change the actual tech stack, that it's not just running the default, Go Ethereum client, right? So if there's any modification that they're trying to do to like get whatever, usually it's additional performance, but it could be anything really. Tie it into like some sort of like gaming SDK, like who knows what that is, or I'm less tapped into this, but changes that have to do with like ZK rollups or ZK EVMs that maybe they're not able to access. I could see, but I think like in the maybe the more controversial answer, but that is like also potentially more accurate, I would say, is um, there's like an over indexing, at least in the VC world, on buying into infrastructure. And so sometimes people are led to take an action not because it like makes rational sense from like an application user standpoint, but because it's like easier to get funding or easier to get the project off of the ground, where they're like um, maybe they're going out to fundraise for an app, and then they're the same app valuation is like they'll only get 20 million, but then if they just apply the same thing toward an infra project, for some reason they can get like 5 or 10x the funding, and so then they lean into doing an infra project almost out of like uh well, funny enough is that's not exactly talking to users, but it's then like talking to investors, and then like having the investors drive what you're working on, which is very different than like it's very different from what you described. But I think um, pretty close to the reality. Like when you see a lot of like uh, chains that are like 99% identical to another one and then change one thing, and you're like, okay, they probably just did that to like raise a round or something, not because it like made sense. Yeah.
Yeah, talking about other chains, can you tell me how do you compare with, say, Sui, Monad, and the rest of them? And do you think that you'll be able to amass a critical user mass or developer mass, to be honest, that are building on top of you? But also, like a second part of this question is, can you tell me about the applications that are built on top of the blockchain?
Yeah. The so the first part you talked on is just on other chains. So one, I guess the ones you named, and it's good also because sometimes people just name like random chains. It seems like you name the ones that are pretty close examples and like the things they prioritize. Um, so for example, like I know Say and Sui are very. I think you said Monad, or I did earlier. That are all like tapped into emphasizing like performance as like a first class thing. And also they I think each of them works on different aspects of parallelizing uh, execution, which is very similar to Nibiru, right? So I know in the Say case and Monad case both work on optimistic execution, and then have different strategies. Like I know um, Say wants to add like other ways of parallelizing the EVM in particular, right? Which is why they focused on just that one VM rather than doing more of the interoperability narrative. In our case, we still want to keep access for other VMs, potentially adding like more in the future. But the way we do parallelization for execution is maybe a bit closer to actually not SUI, but the like Nibiru adaptive execution is for uh, handling conflicting or conflicts and finding them at runtime, which is more similar to Aptos's approach in from a technical standpoint. Um, but yeah, I mean those are some of the most interesting, and I guess like newer chains that we look at because they're our approaches are very similar, at least in what we prioritize from a technical standpoint. Um, then the other aspect you said was like critical mass. So and like what's the app focus on us? So a lot of what we try to focus on in the Nibiru ecosystem is like anything yield bearing tokens that are very simple and easy to explain that don't like add a lot of volatility risk for someone to partake in. So examples would be like tokens that are representations of T-bills, on-chain corporate credit, like collateralized loans, anything that produces user-facing vaults where you can contribute to a pool, and maybe it takes like a complex position with a liquidity manager, or that sort of thing where you're simplifying down layers rather than like creating a lot of new complexity. So as is natural with it being a pretty new ecosystem, a lot of the apps on Nibiru right now are DeFi ones, or just recently launched, even in like the past few weeks. Just like for context, we just added the our Nibiru V2 was like an upgrade we did a couple of months ago that added EVM support. So a lot of the apps that started building right then are just now launching now to go up with our next big campaign. But yeah, so practically speaking, focuses on structured products, passive yield products, and then um, basically anything that's like real yield sources where you don't have just simple staking and inflation. Um, so a lot of that is we're wanting to see is apps tied to real economic activity. So that's not as like uh, that's not going to have as much like insane hype where you have like a pop as much as something that might have like really high APY. But the bigger thing there is you're making something that's like sustainable and probably provides people a more clear utility, at least as end users. So that's been, uh, I guess, how I would describe like the app focus on Nibiru.
And just a completely random question, but how do you think that you compete with Ethereum, because Ethereum now is changing the entire roadmap and they want to have the L1 as a base layer. They're talking about single slot finality. They, in my opinion, are pivoting from the L2 roadmap and they want to increase the throughput of the L1, and it seems like they want to make the L1 extremely fast so developers can build on top of it. And if they're one of the biggest players in the industry and they're changing the roadmap, do you think that there will be space for smaller L1s to then compete against Ethereum and still have enough developers willing to experiment and build on top of them? And I think it's like bringing you back to my previous question of consolidation.
Yeah, I mean, it's realistically, it's possible that like it simplifies down where we're in the earlier nascent part of Web3 where there's still experimentation, like almost like the operating system battle before it was mostly like different flavors of Linux and then, mostly Windows and Mac, right? It may end up that all of the chains like simplify down to being like mostly like the Ethereum and Bitcoin blockchain. It's tough for me to like say what will happen right now, but at least a lot of the like very new innovation on some of those technical improvements seems to have been on not on ETH1, but obviously the team developing Ethereum has been really good with sticking to the long term roadmap and like implementing a lot of those very ambitious changes. So I mean, I think that it still sounds like great news regardless. It's not, you know, my goal necessarily working in the space for like a smaller chain just to succeed at for anyone's personal benefit. I want the whole space to improve. So if that ends up being ETH, then that's fine. I think a lot of projects will then just flock back to the base layer. Then I guess it's but on the maybe the flip side, I think like we did see a lot of success with at least in the past year and a half of like projects that are already pretty strong and were nested very tightly into the Ethereum ecosystem, like leaving it and benefiting very substantially from doing so. Um, so yeah, I don't know that I have a conclusive answer on like what would happen, but that the what you described isn't necessarily bad if that does occur, right?
And another challenge that you might face is dApps that have built on top of a L1 but become extremely big, deciding to launch their own L1 or L2. And I'm just really curious on hearing your take on it, because even with Hyperliquid, they're extremely successful. They have their own L1 kind of mentality. Um, do you think that this is a challenge that not just you but L1s might face overall?
Um, it is a challenge, but at the same time, it's that one would be a like a symptom of success. Like that means the app already did really well on you first to even be in that position. So it is a challenge, but it's not a main challenge because you're basically only going through that if you're in a really good position anyway. I would say so. Yeah, that would be my take on that. I don't think that's the definitely a realistic challenge, but not too big of a it shouldn't be a main priority, I guess. Like if you got known as like a chain that kept producing apps that grew to a size that they ended up launching their own thing and it did well, that would be a good reputation to have.
Yeah, I actually agree with it. It's it's a fair assessment to make. Um, can you tell me a bit more about the incentive and idea that you called Nibiru Party, Block Party, and you announced, I think, last month? Um, what's the idea behind it, and Why did you decide to incentivize the developers to build on top of it during the summer?
Yeah, so we just put up a initial blog post describing how that would work. Just I think not even 2 weeks ago, and the idea there is it's a uh, liquidity campaign for outlining ways like what are the different usable applications that are newly launched on the chain, and then tying them back to um, like a point system, but not in such a way where you can kind of just like go in and spam transactions, but rather that it's like a lot of frequency of snapshotted liquidity. So basically, you're looking at which apps are actually getting usage, and really trying to tie it back to uh, meaningful deployment of liquidity, whether that's like you know as liquidity positions inside dexes, if that's like borrowing in terms of lending, um, usage of like the main perps application, anything like that, and tie it all in such a way that essentially it's not sybiled and it's not farmed, so that you can really bootstrap the ecosystem. So that's good because it gets to tie in like other protocols launching on top can bring in their own incentives on top as well. But basically, it's just meant to be a clever way of bootstrapping the early ecosystem in such a way that it doesn't just grow for 2 or 3 months and then it all like fizzles out.
And that's mainly focusing on developers that are building on top.
It's actually only for users. It's not for developers at all. Um, Rather, apps that are apart, I mean, can partake in that they're gaining additional usage and liquidity brought to their app. But there's nothing that's like just paying for developers to make an app. It's actually all for uh, users and LPs, right, of those applications. And then structure, even change like the structure of our website and how we plug things to look more almost like a Steam store or something, and really try to drive people to all the apps rather than like essentially the chain isn't supposed to take center stage. Um, yeah.
So users that utilize the different apps built on top of Nibiru can gain points that then can be redeemed against the native tokens or whatever. But can you explain to me one more time on how is it different and how are you going to maintain the long-term success of it rather than it fizzling out in a few months?
Yeah, so one is instead of looking at like let's just say a really common thing you see, let's say with like the structure of airdrops, is they'll look at, oh, did you do a certain amount of like transaction volume, or did you deposit this much at like this one random time, or a couple times you did a snapshot. We're looking at one of the big metrics is time weighted like active liquidity, which is just applying a name to essentially instead of looking at what did you do on a random snapshot, or um, how much did you do in terms of just like random wash trading. You're looking at, okay, if I keep taking a view of all the liquidity deployed on these different apps and look at it across like basically where it's um, let's say if you looked at TVL, instead of TVL it's like TVL per minute, and then you did like a scoring system that way, or dollar of TVL per minute, right, if you want to call it that. That would be a good way to like compare, okay, if you put in you know $5,000 but it was for a day versus someone did $5,000 for 30 days, that would be 30 times, like adding that time factor actually is kind of directly rewarding like their time value of money, if you want to look at it that way. So it makes it a lot easier to have a fair scoring system to retain liquidity rather than just having it there for a short while, people farm the incentives and then vanish.
Can you tell me a bit more about the team? Because I listened to an interview with one of your co founders and I was desperately trying to find it because I forgot his name. But I couldn't. And he studied at MIT and he founded the blockchain club at the university. And he's extremely technical. and knowledgeable. Seems like you come from a comparatively technical background. But could you tell me a bit more about the rest of the founders, and how do you manage to work in an industry that seems like is mainly driven by hype? And I found it that technical founders sometimes struggle to promote their projects even though they're really good at what they do and they're exceptional builders, but they struggle to generate this critical mass and enough exposure on Twitter and other social media platforms.
Mhm. Sure. So the team is about there's about 20 of us. The about half technical, half non-technical at the moment. And then the founding team backgrounds are uh, so mine was like physics and AI, um, Columbia University for undergrad and masters, and then was mostly working as an AI software engineer. Another one of the founders, Waterloo grad, top of his class in computing, and then was at Google for several years, and also had prior startup experience. We have someone that's more investment background, so they were at um, the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, doing investments there, and then worked in like investment banking. So two of our people are investment banking background. We found like funny enough, if you can convince people that come over from regular finance, they're used to working like insane hours and like have a lot of the other soft skills that you want. So they so they work really well in like startup culture actually. And then yeah, like you touched on, other founders. One is like an MIT PhD. We had another from investment background, and then one Jimeno. He's been on uh, not working as of late because there was like a well health complications for someone very close to him. But his was very central to working on like the Tendermint team and brought a lot of that Cosmos native expertise. And so that would be like a lot of the core set that's been here for multiple years, but definitely even like new hires from last year are pretty important, I would say. But yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, no, you can continue the point. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I was just gonna get to the other side of your question. So you were asking a bit about like what is I guess you were just touching on there's like a difficulty, or how do technical founders learn to uh like market stuff? If I had to simplify it. Um I guess part of that is like for as many examples I can find of people struggling to do that, I do see a lot of um, it seems like the most successful founders all tends to still be pretty technical in Web3. Like if I'm just looking at like very large protocols or people that make like most of what you would consider like core OG projects or other chains, it seems like they usually need to be pretty technical too. Um, I'm not sure why that is though. I don't know if it's because of just being involved with actually doing the marketing when you're also building the product adds a different like uh, level of like credibility, or just makes it more organic when you're speaking to people. But I don't know what the cause of that is. But it although I can see like yeah a lot of technical founders struggle, it seems like the ones really doing well are also pretty technical too. So.
So, can you tell me a bit more about short-term goals and where do you see Nibiru by the end of this year, but also within 2 years?
Gotcha. Yeah, so short-term goals is like for us it was a big bet to after launch the chain add support for a whole other VM. So that added has like an upfront cost to build it, but then now you basically get to we basically get the benefit of utilizing that stack and all the time spent building that. So one thing, for example, was we got maybe like a tenfold increase in the number of like viable applications that could like were willing to launch on the chain without requiring some like excessive payment or whatever. Like, right? It's one thing if you just have a bunch of money and you offer a grant, and then somebody builds it because they have a grant. But in our case, like a lot of stuff got off the ground as of late from uh, you know, building that interesting like multi-VM stack, and then not because we had to like pay a bunch for it. So the really the short-term goal now is just uh, now that there's a base of applications for people to use, drive as much liquidity and you know and transactions toward them as possible. Just basically be a good shepherd to like the app ecosystem, and then that naturally tends itself more to like I touched on. If you can get more like easy to use passive yield products, you're positioning yourself this niche of like structured products, RWAs, things like that, where people might use it because hey, they're not really trying to get like a crazy, take a crazy risky position or get crazy incentives, but they just want like a safe place to park capital and leave it there. So that the biggest thing now is just really fully realize and execute on all the stuff we've been building toward. Get the like first basically 1 to 2 dozen apps to launch, and then also get the TVL up, up to like the tens of millions, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks. I think these are very good goals to have, and quite realistic. If you guys keep building and working hard on it, I'm sure that you'll be able to achieve it.